Hey guys, it's Daniel. Of the various relationships Layne Staley had over the course of his life, none were more important than his relationship with longtime on-again, off-again girlfriend Demri PARROTT. In this video, I'm going to explore the history of their relationship. I'll be sharing with you various quotes from friends and family members of both Laynes and Demri's, where they discuss their first-hand recollections of what Layne and Demri's relationship was like, and tragically, how Demri PARROTT's untimely death severely impacted Layne. According to Layne Staley's close friend Mark Lanigan, for instance, quote, "Layne never recovered from Demri's death. After that, I don't think he wanted to go on." End quote. Demri died on October 29, 1996, about 5.5 years before Layne on April 5, 2002. I'll be exploring that more in detail later on. Before I get into the specifics of their relationship, I'd like to do a quick overview of their time together. Layne Staley and Demri PARROTT met either in 1988 or 1989. There are different accounts as to how exactly they met, which I'll be taking a look at later on as well. In any case, upon meeting, they immediately felt a connection and began dating shortly afterwards. Layne had a good relationship with Demri PARROTT's family and vice versa. They had the makings of what could have been a long and happy relationship, but unfortunately, that didn't end up being the case. Although Layne and Demri were crazy about each other, they both cheated on each other multiple times over the years, according to multiple people who knew them. They had a very up and down relationship. Despite all of that, however, Layne and Demri got engaged in 1992. What could have been a fresh start for them ultimately didn't pan out. They eventually called off their engagement and parted ways. However, despite parting ways, they still maintained contact with each other all the way until Demri PARROTT's untimely death in October of 96 at the age of 27. Like Layne 6 years later, Demri ultimately died from drugs. Although she died in October of 96, according to Demri's mother, Kathleen, Demri was first admitted to hospital for drug-related reasons in November of 1993. According to Kathleen, quote, "Demri came to the hospital for the first time at the end of November of 93. She was in until January of 94. She got out and was back in March of 94, and at that time put on life support. When she would be in, she would come to the emergency room. They would admit her up into a medicine floor. Then she'd go from the medicine floor to the intensive care unit and life support, and then she wouldn't die. So she'd go back to the medicine floor. She'd be on IV and antibiotics for a month. This went on and on. She had her lungs operated on twice. She had her heart operated on twice. She suffered miserably. She'd tell me, 'I hate being intubated. I can't talk, and these people come and they ask me questions and I can't talk. And I feel like a fish in a fishbowl.'" End quote. Although they were no longer together during the last years of her life, Layne would periodically visit the hospital to check in on Demri. According to Kathleen, she once overheard Layne saying the following to Demri in the hospital, quote, "I should have gotten us out of here. I had the money. I could have done it. I should have gotten us out of here." End quote. Kathleen explains that out of here meant out of Seattle, away from people who were trying to give them drugs and get them high. Unfortunately, when it came to Layne Staley and Demri PARROTT, drugs were a major sore spot in their relationship. Both Layne and Demri have been accused of introducing the other to heroin. Most of the accounts I have read suggest that it was Demri who introduced Layne. However, there are accounts that suggest this was not true. For example, a friend of Demri's, Amber Ferrano, once said the following, quote, "She did not use heroin until she was with him. Demri did not get Layne started in drugs. His history was prior to her, and tons of people know that." End quote. I'll be expanding on this topic of who may have introduced who to heroin later on in this video as well. In any case, Layne Staley ultimately died from drugs on April 5, 2002. Oddly enough, though unrelated to the story of Layne and Demri, Layne died exactly 8 years to the day Kurt Cobain died on April 5th of 94. There's no shortage of tragedy in the story of grunge. Layne Staley's relationship with Demri ended tragically. However, according to Jamie, Layne's sister, there was one aspect of their deaths which provided some solace to their friends and family. Reflecting on Layne Staley's funeral service, Jamie once said the following. This is from Alice in Chains' The Untold Story. Quote, "Looking back on it, a number of us obviously mentioned Demri when speaking at the service. I think that most people had the sense like, well, at least now they're together." End quote. Now, as mentioned earlier, there are different accounts as to how Layne and Demri met. What's agreed on by all parties is that they met in the late 80s, and that soon after meeting, they had begun dating. What's not agreed upon is exactly when, where, and how they met. In one version of the story, Demri was introduced to Layne through a girl named Sally Portillo in 1988. Sally was a friend of Layne's and would hang out with him at the Music Bank, Alice in Chains' rehearsal studio and makeshift living quarters. According to Sally, Demri was already aware of who Layne was, though she had not yet met him. The following is a quote from Sally. Quote, "My feeling on it, I can't say for sure, is that she knew that Layne and I palled around together. I was always with him. He was always with me. I was always at the Music Bank." Demri asked to tell me a little bit about Layne. Will you introduce me to Layne? No one was ever serious relationship-wise until it came to Demri, and then when it came to Layne and Demri, he was all about her. End quote. In another version of how they met, Demri's mother Kathleen once recalled the following. This is from Alice in Chains' The Untold Story. Quote, "She met Layne in 1989. Demri was working in the mall, and there was a girl working in the store with her, and the girl invited her to a party, and the girl was from the Seattle area. Demri told me later that on the way to this party, the girl turned and looked at her and said, 'I just made the biggest mistake of my life.' And Demri said, 'What?' And she said, 'Bringing you to this party. I know my boyfriend's going to fall in love with you.' That was Layne, and the rest is history. I think it was love at first sight." End quote. Now, it's not clear if the girl Kathleen is referring to in that quote is Sally, but if it is, it would seem to align with some of the details of Sally's recollection of how Layne and Demri met. Though, of course, there are still some differences between Kathleen's and Sally's versions of the story, including which year the introduction took place. In any case, for her part, Layne Staley's mother Nancy once said the following. This is from Grunge is Dead. Quote, "I think they met at a party. She was 17 and he 19, about that. He was very shy and she was a bright, shining little star flitting about. As time went on, she was part of the family." End quote. Layne and Demri had good relationships with each other's families. The following is from Demri's mother Kathleen. Quote, "I knew they were hanging out. Layne was very respectful. He was a sweetheart. The two of them, before drugs, were always laughing. They were always happy. But Layne hated the fame. He couldn't go to a cash machine without it being written in the papers. Once at dinner with Layne and Demri, they had just brought our food, the three of us, and were involved in a family conversation. This guy comes up and just, 'You're Layne Staley. My girlfriend's in the back car. I really need your autograph. I have to take it to my girlfriend.' It just kind of hit me the wrong way. I turned and I looked at this person and I said, 'We're trying to have a family dinner here. I'm sure that Layne would love to write his name on a napkin for you after we have our dinner.' And of course, he's backing up and backing off. He apologized and left. Then I said to Layne, 'Oh honey, I'm so sorry. That was not for me to do. Please forgive me.' But he replied, 'Oh Kathleen, I just wish I could take you with me everywhere I go.' People approached my daughter and would say, 'Oh, I know you. You're Layne's girlfriend.' And she would say, 'No, I'm Demri.' Demri had a strong sense of self since she was 2 years old, and she started losing her identity to Layne, being identified as Layne's girlfriend. Layne, on the other hand, started losing his identity to the band. There were times when people came up to him and said, 'Oh, I know you. You're Alice in Chains.' And he'd say, 'Do I look like an Alice to you?' End quote. Layne's fame not only hurt Demri, however, but also Layne himself. The following is also from Kathleen from Alice in Chains' The Untold Story. Quote, "Once when Layne was in rehab, I got to visit him on a Sunday afternoon. I think Jerry and Sean had been there and left when I got there. I think I saw them. Layne was sitting outside on this picnic table talking, and all of a sudden you hear Alice in Chains music. Layne was devastated. He started to cry because from that point on, he wasn't a guy with an addiction problem going to treatment. He was Alice in Chains." End quote. Fame ultimately had a negative impact on Layne's relationship with Demri. In an interview with journalist John Widerhorn that was released in Rolling Stone on February 8th of 96, Layne Staley said the following when reflecting on his breakup with Demri. Quote, "I can definitely say rock and roll was a huge factor in us breaking up. When you're in a relationship, the girl usually instigates the big idea that you were joined at the hip. So when the grifting comes, it's really painful. This isn't a dig on women, but I think women are so different chemically from men, and it makes it hard to sustain a relationship. They have periods. They go through horrific, awful emotional swings. And trying to be logical with a person that's got a whole different logic running around in her brain is just impossible. When you're in a relationship, the girl usually instigates this big truth that you were put on earth to be together. And after being with a person a long time and being convinced that you're soulmates, you can get really crushed if things eventually fall apart. When I broke up with my last real girlfriend, life was just dismal. I didn't know how to live or what to do. And then I had to realize, okay, I got along for 20 years before I met her, and I had good times. But right now I'm alone, and I'm totally cool with it. End quote. One particular episode which hurt Layne's relationship with Demri was the album cover for Dirt. Released in 1992, Dirt is considered by many as Alice in Chains' best album. The album cover for Dirt is one of the most iconic images in grunge history. The album cover features a young woman laying on her back on a cracked desert floor, her body partially buried underneath. The model in the image looks like Demri, but it isn't her. It was somebody else. According to Demri's mother, Kathleen, Demri was very hurt by this. More on that shortly. The model featured in the image is Mariah O'Brien, and the photographer is Rocky Shank, who's worked with Alice in Chains on many occasions. The following is a quote from Rocky Shank, where he explains how they created the image. This quote is from Alice in Chains' The Untold Story. Quote, "We created the cracked desert floor with clay rolled out on foam core raised up on apple boxes. There was a cutout in the center of the foam core for the model to slip into, so she would appear half buried in the desert floor. I cut the miniature mountains out of foam core as well, and we put up a painted sky backdrop behind the mountains. Mariah's hair was short at the time, so we put a long wig on her so her hair would flow out artistically into the desert floor. After getting her in place, we sealed her up with more clay, which we then dried around her with hair dryers. Poor Mariah was stuck in that position for many, many hours as I tried a variety of different lighting effects and visual approaches." End quote. Now, as mentioned, the model on the album cover is Mariah O'Brien, though at the time the album was released, many of the people close to the band thought it was Demri PARROTT, Layne Staley's longtime on-again, off-again girlfriend. According to Demri's mother, Kathleen Austin, Demri was hurt that the band hired a model who looked like her to be on the cover. The following is a quote from Kathleen Austin. Quote, "Demri was really hurt when they chose a model that looked so much like her that people thought it was her, because it put her in a position where people would come up to her and say, 'Oh wow, I saw you on the cover of Dirt,' and she'd have to say, 'No, that's not me.' Sometimes people believed her, and sometimes they didn't believe her. She wouldn't have minded if they got a model that didn't look like her, but it put her in a really awkward position, and it was really hurtful to her. She was just trying to maintain her own identity, never wanted to just be known as somebody's girlfriend." End quote. According to Kathleen Austin, Layne Staley's rising fame was beginning to overshadow Demri PARROTT's identity. She isn't even sure if Demri would have posed for the album cover if she'd been asked to. It's interesting Kathleen would say that because Demri did in fact do some modeling. Demri PARROTT was a very outgoing artistic person ever since she was a child. She was born on February 22nd, 1969 to Stephen PARROTT and Kathleen Austin. Though they wouldn't meet until the late 80s, there are several parallels between Demri PARROTT's childhood and Layne Staley's childhood. Like Layne, Demri's parents would divorce. Like Layne, Demri would live with her mother, and like Layne, Demri's mother would remarry. As a matter of fact, Demri's mother remarried twice. Demri had one half-brother from Kathleen's second marriage and two half-brothers from Kathleen's third marriage. Interestingly, Kathleen was actually a practicing counselor working in addiction. She once told author David DeSola the following, quote, "If anybody had ever told me that my daughter would become a heroin addict, I wouldn't have believed it." End quote. As mentioned, Demri was a very artistic, outgoing person. When Demri was in high school, she was part of the school choir. Her high school choir teacher, Lyle Ford, once recalled the following. This is from Alice in Chains' The Untold Story. Quote, "Demri really did love music and the performing arts. She definitely had the bent towards the performing arts and was very social. Some students, they really don't go up and talk to teachers. They kind of hang with their friends. Demri was very social with other students and their teachers. She was a competent singer. but I think she was also a dancer." End quote. Carrie Pfeiffer Simmons, a friend of Demri's from school, once said the following about her. Quote, "She was very outgoing, very well liked, just petite, beautiful. She just lit up the room. She liked to be the class clown, get attention, and joke around. She would sneak out through the windows of the classroom and skip class. She was always doing funny things or charming the teachers so that she would get good grades that way. I know that she wanted to be in acting, and I know that she wanted to be an actress and be in movies. She had to be in the limelight." End quote. Kathleen once recalled that a few months prior to meeting Layne, Demri had an audition for a singing part in a musical called Cinderella Rock. It was a public audition in a mall in front of an audience. As Kathleen recalls, quote, "She starts this song and then she stops and says, 'Obviously you can tell I can't sing.' Then she just played the crowd. It was amazing." End quote. Given Demri's charming personality and good looks, it's no surprise a lot of guys were attracted to her. There was one specific situation in particular where this became a problem for Layne. Though Layne and Demri were crazy about each other, they both cheated on each other multiple times. One particular instance which really bothered Layne was Demri Perrot's relationship with Dwayne Bodenheimer. Dwayne was, and still is, the singer of The Derelicts, a punk band from Seattle. Demri and Dwayne started a relationship at some point in 1990-91. The problem was, Demri's relationship with Dwayne began while she was still with Layne. Dwayne Bodenheimer and Demri saw each other usually while Layne Staley was out touring with Alice in Chains. For his part, Layne Staley had his suspicions and eventually knew what was going on. He confronted Dwayne Bodenheimer about the situation several times, most notably during the shoot for the movie Singles. Shot in Seattle from March 11, 1991 to May 24th of 91, the Singles movie holds a unique place in grunge history. Musicians from several Seattle bands including Soundgarden, Pearl Jam, and Alice in Chains were involved with the film in various capacities. One day, during the shooting for the movie, Layne and Dwayne were sitting at the same table. According to Dwayne Bodenheimer, Layne Staley said the following to him, quote, "It should have been you that died instead of Andy Wood. I hate you." End quote. Andy Wood, of course, was the lead singer of Mother Love Bone and Malfunction. He died of a heroin overdose on March 19, 1990, about a year before the Singles movie shoot. Regarding Layne's comment that Dwayne should have died instead of Andy, Dwayne himself once recalled the following, quote, "Layne said that to me, and that was very hurtful. It hurt me. I wasn't like a total jerk. I did have feelings. I felt bad about what was going on, but I couldn't help it because I really did love her. She really just, blew me away. Beautiful, amazing girl. Good energy, just amazing. I developed a little crush on her. Demri and I started hanging out. She was a very sexual girl, and I tried to not do that because I knew who her boyfriend was, but it just happened one day. We had a relationship, and there were drugs involved. We were together a lot. I fell in love with her. I really cared for her and loved her. She kind of said that her and Layne had a kind of open relationship." End quote. David Duet, a friend of Layne's, once confirmed the open nature of Layne's relationship with Demri. Quote, "Layne and Demri had kind of an open relationship. In the position he was in, it's probably the only way he could have had a lasting relationship. Layne was very true to Demri in his heart, but he related many, many wild touring adventures to me." End quote. Now, going back to Demri and Dwayne Bodenheimer, according to Dwayne, it was ultimately Demri who called off their relationship. Despite the very intense ups and downs between Demri and Layne Staley over the years, the two continued to care for each other, even after they had officially parted ways a few years prior to Demri's death in 1996. Though it is known that Layne Staley and Demri Perrott were not together during the last years of her life, it's not clear exactly when the breakup took place, or who exactly broke up with who. According to musician Randy Biro, a friend of the band's who also contributed some vocal work to Jar of Flies, it was Demri who broke up with Layne. Quote, "She stopped seeing him. She tried to get away from him because she felt like she was going to ruin his life. He was in love with her. But everybody knew that Layne was blaming Demri, and people were trying to keep them apart all the time. So I was under the impression that she tried to get away from him to give him a chance to live life. I, however, had no interest in breaking them up. There was no one to blame for his drug addiction." End quote. Over the years, even while they were alive, many people blamed Demri for Layne Staley's addiction to heroin. Many people believe she was the one who introduced him to the drug. However, as mentioned before, there are those who suggest this was not the case. For example, a friend of Demri's, Amber Ferrano, once said the following, quote, "She did not use heroin until with him. Demri did not get Layne started in drugs. His history was prior to her, and tons of people know that." End quote. Now, one of the people who has accused Demri of being the one to introduce Layne to heroin is John Starr. John Starr is actually the father of Mike Starr, Alice in Chains' original bass player. Like Layne, Mike also had his struggles with heroin. John Starr once said the following, quote, "Drugs came as a result of Layne's connection with Demri. They did no drugs until they started touring. I loved her. Her and I got along great. Mike and Layne and her had more fun than everybody else on tour together. But she introduced Layne to heroin. Layne introduced Mike to heroin." End quote. For her part, Demri's mother Kathleen once said the following, quote, "People who love Demri blame Layne for her addiction. That's what people do when you love somebody and they're hanging with somebody else and they're doing bad things. You don't blame that person. You say, oh, it's their friends. Oh, he's running with a bad group of people." End quote. Regardless of who introduced who, both Demri and Layne died heroin-related deaths. Layne in 2002 and Demri in 1996. The following is from Krisha Agarat, an ex-girlfriend of Jerry Cantrell's. This is from Grunge's Dead. Quote, "Layne and Demri. Another really cute couple that seemed very happy, but very destructive. Oddly enough, I worked at Espresso Roma in the University District in Seattle, and she was working there as well. I didn't know her, and then later on, I saw her again. I think she went out with Paul Uhler from Sweetwater first, and then she started dating Layne. Kind of went back and forth between those two a couple of times. She was like the sweetest, cutest tiny hippie chick. Just adorable and gorgeous. Never would I have ever imagined what happened to her happening. She started using heroin with Layne, I guess. That was later on in their relationship when it got really bad. They were both using, and they were both junkies, essentially. They stopped seeing each other, they went different ways. I know for a fact that she ended up doing all kinds of things for drugs, and unfortunately, ended up in the hospital dying." End quote. According to Demri's mother, Kathleen, Demri spent much of the last years of her life in and out of the hospital. Though they were no longer together, Layne would often check in on her. Quote, "Demri was sick and dying for those last 2.5 years. Layne would come by and stay with her in the hospital at night. Layne never recovered from losing her." End quote. That sentiment, that Layne never recovered from Demri's death, has been shared by many people who knew Layne. Jeff Gilbert, a DJ from Seattle who knew Layne, once said the following, quote, "Where it really went off the tracks for Layne was when his girlfriend Demri succumbed to heroin in October of '96. Those two were supposed to be together. That was a no-brainer for everyone who knew them. She was all he wanted to be with. She was such a small little gal, and the drugs just shut her down. After that, he was never the same." End quote. Nick Pollock, a friend of Layne's, shared a similar perspective. Quote, "I know how much he loved Demri, and I can only imagine that really just obliterated him." End quote. Another friend of Layne's, Michelle Aaron Crane, who was loosely romantically linked with Layne after Demri, once said the following, quote, "I think it's very likely he used her death as an excuse to throw in the towel, because that's what we do. The addict is always looking for excuses to use, and that's a pretty good one." End quote. Randy Byro, another friend of Layne's, put it poignantly, quote, "When she died, that was it. He was done." End quote. Reflecting on Demri's death, Layne Staley's stepfather, Jim, recalled the following to author David DeSola, quote, "I went over to the hospital and gave her a kiss on the forehead goodbye, and she was looking very peaceful. Layne obviously knew what had happened and was distraught and so forth. And while they had a very dynamic relationship, they certainly cared about each other and loved each other. So, Alice in Chains manager Susan Silver and I said our goodbyes. Mark Lanegan stayed with Layne at Layne's house, and that was the best thing to do." End quote. Mark Lanegan and Layne Staley were very close friends. As a matter of fact, Mark Lanegan was one of the last people to have interacted with Layne during his final years. Though Demri's passing, of course, wasn't the exact cause of Layne's death, it certainly contributed to his downfall in a very big way. According to Mark Lanegan, especially after Demri's death, Layne was determined on doing drugs regardless of the consequences. In an interview with Rolling Stone published on April 23, 2020, Mark Lanegan told the following to journalist Corey Groh about the death of Layne Staley. Quote, "Out of my friends, I was the guy who they always thought would never have a chance of getting clean because I was so maniacal in my approach. I would have climbed Mount Everest for drugs. I was always trying to kick. Layne Staley was a magical person who was also hell-bent on doing drugs until he died. The first time I saw him after I'd gotten clean, I'd been clean a year. I'm pretty sure that Jerry Cantrell and Mike Inez flew me up to Seattle because they were unable to get into his house. He had a camera and lived in the penthouse of this condo. So whenever anybody from that camp would come to see him, he would just ignore it. Jerry and Mike knew that when he saw me, he would let me in. I went along with that. And I also wanted him to see that I was clean, that it was possible to get clean, that his prediction that I would never be able to do it had failed. Hopefully, maybe it would give him the idea that he himself could do it too. But he didn't want to do it. When I got there, I said, 'Hey man, it's been a while. I've been clean for more than 12 months. And he was like, 'No, you weren't, man. You just left like 2 months ago.' His sense of time had warped, and he wasn't buying the truth from me. I remember him saying at that point, 'I always just keep thinking I'm going to get that same feeling I got the first time again.' And dude, I never got that first feeling again after the first time I ever did dope. I immediately had to do 5 times more to even get close to it. So for me, that was an impossibility, but that was his obsession. It's heartbreaking the way he went. I always knew that that's what was going to happen. Although I had always hoped that there would be some medical emergency that would put him in the hospital and give him a moment away from the routine of crack and heroin that might give him a break and some insight. That medical emergency ended up being his death. I still love listening to Alice in Chains. When they come on the radio, it makes me feel good. But if Nirvana comes on the radio, it throws me into a depression. Like, if I'm in an Uber, you have to turn that off. And I think it's because of my own actions in the deaths of both these guys who I loved equally. Of course, I was not a great influence on Layne, but drugs were a mutual thing. I put it like this. Kurt was like a little brother. Layne was like a twin." End quote. Layne Staley ultimately died on April 5, 2002, though his body wasn't discovered for a few weeks. One of the notable things about Layne Staley's funeral service is that Demri was noticeably present in a sense. The following is from Kathleen, Demri's mother. Quote, "Because Layne basically became a recluse after Dem died, a lot of the stories about Layne ended when Demri died. So the people that got up and talked at his funeral, a lot of the stories were Layne and Demri and I, and there were photographs of her I'd never seen before. It was like being at a memorial service for my daughter 6 years later." End quote. Layne Staley's sister, Jamie, once shared a similar sentiment when reflecting on Layne's funeral service. Quote, "Looking back on it, a number of us obviously mentioned Demri when speaking at the service. I think that most people had the sense like, well, at least now they're together." End quote. Layne and Demri were one of the tragic couples in the story of Grunge, a story which unfortunately has no shortage of tragedy. Now, as mentioned previously, during the years in between Layne Staley's breakup with Demri and Demri's death, the two of them still interacted with each other, most notably when Layne would go visit Demri when Demri was in the hospital at various points. As mentioned a bit earlier, there was another woman in Layne's life named Michelle Erin Crane. Layne didn't meet Michelle after Demri. They already knew each other. But their friendship really took off after Layne's breakup. As a matter of fact, according to Michelle, Layne at one point thought they were dating. Though they were never officially together, and though they apparently were never intimate, Michelle and Layne did have somewhat of a quasi-relationship. Michelle spent lots of time with Layne and was one of the few people he would allow into his apartment. According to Michelle, sometimes when she would be with Layne in his apartment, Demri would come knocking on the door. The following is a quote from Michelle Erin Crane where she discusses this. This is from Grunge is Dead. Quote, Layne and his girlfriend Demri were together forever. Finally, they had broken up because he took the attitude that she was worse than he was. But I think she had to do worse things because she didn't have any money. When I would be over there at night watching movies, the doorbell would ring all the time, and he would be like, shh, be quiet, pretend we're not here. Sometimes, maybe it was her, and sometimes people coming to party with him. So I asked, are you guys totally broken up? What's the deal? And he said that she was pretty much a drug addict at that point, and was really struggling. I remember going over there in the afternoon once, and there was a note from her. It was like, I love you. I hope you're doing well. He talked about her, and then when she finally died, even though they weren't together, he was devastated. You'd go to the house, go to the bathroom, and it was scary. Blood on the sink and stuff like that. I just grabbed garbage bags and started cleaning up. It was clear that he liked me, but we never fooled around because honestly, I was scared that he might have a disease. It seemed like he was getting the wrong idea after a couple of months. I just said, I can't keep coming over here and pretending everything is cool when it's not cool. End quote. The following are various quotes from Michelle Erin Crane where she discusses her relationship with Layne Staley. These quotes are from Grunge is Dead and Alice in Chains' The Untold Story. According to Michelle, on one occasion in particular when she was over at Layne's apartment watching TV with him, Layne said the following to her, quote, I want you to know I'm not going to be like this forever. I want to have a normal life, a good life. I want to get married. I want to have kids. End quote. The following is a quote from Michelle Erin Crane where she reflects on this. This is from Alice in Chains' The Untold Story. Quote, I thought what he said was very sweet. I was flattered because I knew he was saying it for my benefit. It was his way of saying to me, I like you. If you hang out for a while, I may be able to kick this with your support. Give me a reason to stop doing drugs. That is what his words meant, at least to some degree. But how can you take someone so loaded on drugs very seriously? He may have thought that in the moment, and he may have considered it from time to time, but the fact is just as quickly, he was back in the bathroom trying to find a vein. I wanted to like him, but I don't know if he had a disease. I don't know what the deal is. I'm not going to get involved with that, but I guess I was hoping foolishly that I could make a difference and inspire some sobriety or something, and then maybe I would have tried dating him if he had cleaned up, because I was definitely fond of him. At one point, he thought we were dating, but he realized we were not. His desire to want to spend time with me without wanting anything but some companionship was nice. Being invited into his rather isolated private world was intriguing to say the least. That, coupled with the fantasy that he might get over his addiction or that I could play a part in him getting over his addiction, was intriguing and even exciting. He was a beautiful person under all of that sickness. But I wasn't delusional, and I wasn't about to express these thoughts to him because I guess I had decided rather quickly that to hope would be to be disappointed. So I remained rather cool during our time spent together. I once had this epic dream that I was walking around this 60s motel. I was walking by all these motel rooms, and each door was open. In each room, there was a totally different scene going on. I walked by one door and looked in, and Layne is in the motel room. There's a kitchenette, and there's a pot on every burner of the stove. They're boiling over, and he was really perplexed and like, this stuff's boiling over. Kinda chaotic. I go in to take his hand, and I'm like, let's get out of here. End quote. Now, of course, Layne Staley's most well-known relationship was his relationship with longtime on-again, off-again girlfriend Demri PARROTT. Despite the fact that they were no longer together when she died, Demri's drug-related death in 1996 severely impacted Layne emotionally. In Michelle's opinion, Demri's death contributed to Layne's eventual downfall. Quote, I think it's very likely he used her death as an excuse to throw in the towel, because that's what we do. The addict is always looking for an excuse to use. And that's a pretty good one. My aunt was the queen of the metal scene in the 80s, and Layne had a huge walk-in closet. It was his rental room at her place. Alice in Chains were total rockers then. I was really into the punk scene and thought they were kind of ridiculous. She was always trying to put me and Layne together. And I remember thinking it was cheesy because he had long golden blonde hair and he wore makeup and spandex. It was a weird thing. I had a dream about him one night, and my phone rang in the morning. My aunt woke me up. She said, "Guess who I saw last night?" And I said, "Layne?" She's like, "I did. And he thought the girl I was with was you." He came running up to me and gave me and my girlfriend a hug, and then realized it wasn't you. Anyways, this one time I walked out of my apartment and he drove past me. He was a passenger in the car. The only thing I recognized was his eyes. He had big blue eyes, because his hair had grown out and was moosey brown. We made eye contact, the car pulled over, and his mom was driving. He got out. He looked terrible. His hands were all wrapped in ice bandages, with fingerless leather gloves over the bandages. He was holding this little kitten that his mom was helping him take to the vet. He jumped out of the car, and I was taken aback. It was shocking to see him look like that. He shook his head like, "Come to the other end of the car away from my mom." He's like, "Hey, I was wondering, are you in the program?" He meant Alcoholics Anonymous. I was like, "No, but I know a lot of people who are. I could hook you up with someone." He took my number and started calling me. It turns out that he only lived a few blocks away. So I started going over to his house. I was curious, felt sorry for him. We went and saw a few shows together, and he mostly wanted to hang out and watch movies because he was a wreck. The first couple of times I came over, he was like, "One day I would like to have a family. This is what's going on now, but I'm not always going to be like this." A couple of times he disappeared and I was concerned because we talked every day for a while. One time I didn't get a hold of him for a couple of days and he called me and said he was out in the woods with somebody, calling from a payphone. He didn't say it, but I could tell he was trying to detox. He had open sores, and I heard he ended up losing some fingers or his hands. I don't know exactly what was true. The last time I saw him, I was out for a jog, and this Trans Am with the Firebird painted on the hood had crashed into an ambulance. Layne and some white trash guy were fumbling around. Layne always wore this Australian big raincoat towards the end, and he was picking up all this stuff that was falling out of the car and out of his pockets. And every time he would bend over to pick something up, more paraphernalia would fall out of his pocket. It was weird. I will often awake in the middle of the night with the thoughts of Layne. I remember a sad or a sweet look he gave me, and even though I know it's stupid, never trust a junkie, I find myself riddled with guilt for not being more sensitive, open, or even helpful. He would often imply he was looking for a reason to get clean, and I replay those moments over and over again. These flashes in time sometimes keep me awake for hours and make my heart hurt. I know I hurt his feelings, and that haunts me. I wish I had been more sensitive, because I know, most people know, how capable he was of loving someone. Look at his love for Demri. But intellectually, I guess I did the right thing for me.